Now we are going to start our second lecture for today, Pastoral Theory, UK and US Dimensions.
Yes. Is this one on? I know I want to use the PowerPoint. Okay, I was told to use the mic for this session because some people couldn't hear me at the back. I'm sorry about that. I always think of myself as a shouting teacher, but I didn't shout enough. So I'm going to again take a rather unusual approach to the start of this introduction to pastoral theory. And I'm just going to say that pastoral theory, pastoral literature, in a sense, I will be defining it in a moment, is literature about the countryside. Okay, it's a tradition in the Western tradition that dates back to the 3rd century BC, and actually, as a matter of fact, to Egypt. Because the Greek poet Theocritus wrote a poem for the court at Alexandria. And I just found out, since I was here, that the court of Alexandria, who received the Idylls, the title of the poem by Theocritus, the people who read the Idylls in the court was 24 people, and probably 8 people were the specialists. They specialised in different groups, and probably 8 people were the readers of the Idylls of Theocritus. I didn't know that until I came here and received a tour of the pyramids from Dr. Azar, who told me that's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, he was writing for a very specific audience. And the Idylls is a poem that remembers the shepherd song competitions on Sicily, the island of Sicily in the Mediterranean, in the youth of Theocritus. And so it's about shepherds, and it's about the past, and it's about the countryside far away from the audience in Alexandria. And the Idylls, by the way, gives us the word idyllic in English. So we already, in the founding text of Pastoral, have the notion of the idyllic, and therefore of idealization, of the past, of youth, of a country far away that concerns shepherds and their song competitions. Okay? And then, of course, the Roman writer Virgil was very much influenced by the Idylls of Theocritus, and Virgil wrote a series of poems about the countryside called the Eclogues. And the Eclogues have also come to be regarded as the founding text of the pastoral tradition. And in fact, writers and poets, particularly in England, particularly in the 18th century, wanted to recreate a literature of the countryside that was based on the Eclogues of Virgil. But Theocritus is the guy who started the whole thing off. Okay. I'm going to show you a picture of my village in Spain. Oh, yes, so I'm asking, why should pastoral literature be of interest to us today? And I'm talking about understanding the social construction of place and nature and what we call the environment. So you see how this follows on from the previous lecture. This is now a branch of eco-criticism. So this is the branch of eco-criticism that is concerned with pastoral theory and pastoral studies, and was indeed one of the first terms that early eco-critics used and saw themselves engaging with the pastoral tradition in American literature and in British literature. By the way, I'm going to be referring to an American tradition of pastoral writing here, because I know quite a number of you will be in American studies, and comparing it to a very different tradition of pastoral theory in the UK. So here is the village of Sella in Alicante province, and our house is just on the top street up here, just there. We look down over the other houses. This is a village of 600 people in the mountains. It's 20 minutes from the beach, from the sea, where we go for the supermarket and for swimming. But it's very much a mountain environment, and it's very much terraced here for the growth of almond trees. Almond trees, like olive trees, don't need water, so they grow on the terraces above the village. The village is where two rivers join from each side here, so below the village there are orange trees and lemon trees, because they need water at least once a year. So it's a village where two rivers, on the spur where two rivers join. So I've just come back from this village to Cairo directly, having hosted our MA at Pastoral University in travel and nature writing. We have a distance learning MA, so you're not in residence at the university. These people are based all around the world, and they are in. They do Skype with their tutor, and they have 3 residentials a year, and one of these residentials has to be outside England because it's travel writing, so they have to travel, and I host them in my village here and become one of the tutors for a week in Sella. Okay, so I begin with it looks like the New Jerusalem, doesn't it? Blake's New Jerusalem. It looks like paradise, doesn't it? And indeed, some people in this village think they do live in paradise. By the way, this is an entirely Spanish village, Valencian speaking, not speaking regular Catalan Spanish. So yes, they think they live in paradise. They really do. It's not a joke, you know. El Paraíso. And if I write a poem every year for the village yearbook, and I often drop in the idea that they're living in paradise and tease them a bit with it, as you shall see. It's also oops, okay. I've left my hand against something. Yeah. This is all. The Moors lived in Spain for 400 years. For 400 years, Spain was an Arab country, and Arabic architecture, irrigation patterns, now in decay, are very, very strong in Spain. And indeed, even the language and place names in Spain retain a Moorish influence. So one of the springs of our village is at Alcantara. Alcantara was the first bridge across the village, and my friends from the University of Alicante, who live in a very posh apartment in Alicante, come once a fortnight to dip their water bottles in the spring and take home the water from Alcantara which is regarded as being very health-giving. People have favourite springs around the place. But that's just to give you an idea of the presence of the Moorishness. This, of course, makes it a tourist attraction. So Moorish village to tourists means an old, ancient, narrow-streeted village. It doesn't just mean a place inhabited by the Moors. It is kind of like, all of these terms should be in inverted commas, really, I think, because that's what they are. They are constructions, you know. And indeed it was called Solda Seir by people who wanted to build son of Seir, Seir in the sunshine, for people who wanted to build a new estate on the edge of the village. They marketed it as Solda Seir. Thank goodness 2008 happened and the construction companies went bankrupt and the estate was never built. So we still have our original village. But Solda Seir was, you know, was being sold as one of the labels, literally a label of this village. It's also, as I pointed out, a confluence village. It's also a spring village. It's on the spring line, as I've said. It's also a restaurant mountain village. So people come up from the coast where all the tourists are, on the Costa Blanca of Spain. They come up to eat at the restaurants in this village. It's also a commuter village. People who do work, who live in the village, go down to the coast where the employment is in servicing the tourist industry. We went there because it's a rock climbing village. It has a crag outside. This is the driest rock in Europe in the winter, and so I went there rock climbing originally with my son and my climbing partner 25 years ago. My wife has written a walking guide to this area, to the Costa Blanca of Spain, and so it is also a village that attracts walkers. And she's written a guide to 50 sort of footpaths, 50 walks in the Costa Blanca, often walking over the mountains on her own to find these paths and to record them. It's very much a weekend village. The young people come back to the family houses in this village at the weekends. And so during the week, it's just the old people, really, who are left in the village. But the weekends are terrific because the youngsters organise the fiestas. And Friday night is terrific because everyone's finished work and they all meet up with their school friends with whom they were at primary school in the village at the weekends. It was an almond producing village until California stole the almond market from Spain, and now almond growing is very much a hobby, really, I suppose, for pit money, really. You know, and we also have almond terraces above the village. And in a sense, it's a dying village. The village school barely keeps enough children to keep it going. The old people are dying off, of course, and in a sense, there's a very real sense in which this is barely sustainable. We just keep a doctor. There are enough old people like me who have ailments to keep a doctor in business, but the village school is very much under threat, I think, from small numbers. And 2 winters ago, we had exceptional heavy rainfall. And this is climate change now taking its effect. Those terraces which had stood for centuries, which had been built by the Moors and had stood all rainfall for centuries, were washed away 3 years ago when we had rainfall in December that soaked all the ground, and then rainfall again, heavy rainfall, unknown in Spain, really heavy rainfall for a full week in saturated ground in the end of January, a month later, and all of those terraces collapsed. We were driving down a narrow lane and a wall fell down in front of us. and mudslide. Mudslides are unheard of in Spain. This is climate change. A mudslide came across the road in front of us. I had to reverse back up on a single narrow track, and a mudslide took place behind us, as I would have reversed into it had I been seconds earlier. And so we had to abandon our car between two mudslides. And so this area, which took a long time to repair, and indeed is still being repaired now, the village has been given extra funding to employ 6 people to clear the edges of roads now and create the drains again on the edges of roads. This is now a climate change emergency zone. It's an official zone because of climate change. It's an emergency zone for needing extra funding. So what do you notice with the beginning of this list and the end of this list?
The fall of Adam is a human condition from paradise.
That's right. So we begin with idealization of paradise. For me, paradise is an idealization. I'm a realist and I don't believe paradise exists. And so we begin with idealization and we end with the opposite of idealization, what one might call anti-pastoral. So it might begin with a pastoral term, paradise, and end with an anti-pastoral emergency zone area. So what I'm showing you is that one single place might be constructed idealistically as a paradise, as a pastoral place in the countryside to live. On the other hand, it might be constructed as an anti-pastoral place to live, which is in danger. And we were in danger. We drove down the road and the police were turning us back and saying, you must go back in your houses because huge rocks are falling onto the main road going up to the village. This is anti-pastoral living, I'll tell you, when you could have your car swept off the road by a big boulder. Okay. So, we should be interested in pastoral literature today because to help us understand the social constructions of environment in either idealized pastoral terms or in the opposite, anti-pastoral terms perhaps. Pastoral, says Lawrence Buell, is a species of cultural equipment that Western thought has for more than 2 millennia been unable to do without. In other words, the pastoral tradition in Western literature is 2,000 years old, and we've been unable to do without it in some way or other in our literature for all of that time. And Leo Marx, remember Leo Marx, The Machine in the Garden, which is very much about the American pastoral, as he calls it, says the wholly new conception of the precariousness of our relations with nature is bound to bring forth new versions of pastoral. So Leo Marx sees this as a continuing tradition which is going to be needed in its new forms to engage with our new awareness of the precariousness of our environmental crisis. In other words, Leo Marx is saying that the environmental crisis is bound to bring forward new forms of pastoral literature, new ways of writing about the countryside within this 2 millennia old tradition of writing. So eco-criticism rereads texts from the present environmental crisis of the Anthropocene, it rereads texts of the past, and it very much focuses on texts which deal with the countryside, texts that are in the pastoral tradition. And pastoral theory provides a frame of evaluation for reading these texts. So I'm going to suggest, incidentally, I'm an old Levicite and I very much believe that life is short and we can't read all the books that we want to read. We therefore have to select them, we therefore have to be evaluative, And we need in our environmental crisis, especially, to be evaluative and critical of texts which endorse a mastery of nature, the old ways that have got us into this situation, and fresh ways of looking at nature, texts which provoke new ways of thinking about nature. And so evaluation, as far as I'm concerned, is inescapable. And I have always believed that literary criticism undertaken by students should be looking for both the strengths and the weaknesses of texts. And pastoral theory gives you a criteria for identifying the weaknesses of texts as well as their strengths. There's a great temptation among students to be enthusiastic about a writer and enthusiastic about a text and want to write an essay that's totally enthusiastic about what this writer achieves, but we need to also be aware of the weaknesses in writing, the weaknesses in text, especially if we're going to get high marks. I think we need to be able to critique texts and identify their limitations as well as their strengths, and to come to some conclusion about the balance of those. And pastoral theory, I think, provides us now, it provides eco-criticism with a way of evaluating texts. So here is British pastoral in the Anthropocene. So we now have sheep grazing. I mentioned that sheep are essential for the founding texts of pastoral, which were concerned with herdsmen. Virgil's eclogues, conversations between herdsmen, and Theocritus's idylls were the shepherds' song competitions. So here are sheep grazing in the Anthropocene in the UK, where we know that we need to find alternative sources of power and move away from polluting fossil fuels. Okay? So there is my image of pastoral for our times. I'll go back because you didn't get your photograph, did you? So here it is. This is a great image, I think, for our times, yeah? The way in which we need to be part of a continuing grazing pastoral tradition, but within terms that address the environmental crisis through finding alternative sources of power. So, as usual, I talk about sea level rise as I do everywhere, and show that map as I do everywhere. But I want now to come to 4 uses of pastoral. I'm revising my book Pastoral, which some of you may know. I'm writing at the moment the 2nd edition, and in the 2nd edition there will be 3 uses of the term pastoral. Sorry, there will be 4 instead of 3 in the 1st edition. That will be one of the changes. The other one of the changes, when I was writing in Spain before I came here and before I hosted the MA group, was a new chapter for my pastoral book on Georgic literature, more of which in a moment. So, first of all then, I've already told you about the classical tradition that is the founding of the pastoral tradition by Theocritus and then later by Virgil. The term's also used for any literature that describes the countryside in contrast to the city, and that contrast is an essential element of pastoral. Sometimes the city isn't present in the text, but the text is quite clearly aimed at a city readership. So the city is present in the audience, as it were, implicitly in some pastoral texts. And I'm thinking of Shakespeare's pastoral dramas, you know, where people escape the court, go to the Forest of Arden, or in King Lear go to a tougher place, the blasted heath, and experience in the Forest of Arden a change in direct contrast, confrontation with raw nature, and therefore return to the court changed and ready for marriage, matured, with a different, more mature attitude. Huh? And in Lear's case, returning from the heath, humbled but too late to actually save Cordelia. It's also, and you need to be aware of this, especially in Australian literature, of course, pastoral simply means a grazing landscape, a landscape in which grazing takes place. So a literature which is concerned with grazing, and of course Australian literature is very much full of both sheep and grazing landscapes. And that's reminded me that I missed this one out in the first edition. But in English literary criticism, it has become a pejorative, it's become a negative. And you can tell that from the verb. To pastoralize something is to idealize it, is to write about it as though it were in a pastoral, yeah? And Raymond Williams is very much responsible of this country and the city for having left us with a very strong sense that pastoral literature idealizes, falsifies, and that term now has become pejorative, yeah? This isn't the case in America, where pastoral is not seen as a pejorative sense, but where there is a continuing belief, as Leo Marx indicates, in a continuing pastoral tradition that will take new forms. Yeah, very important distinction. So when I say it's a pejorative word, I'm really referring to British culture since Raymond Williams. Okay, so I mentioned the two